Are you still trying to work out what the dative is in German? A lot of people, I think, are a little bit scared of it, but there's no reason really, because it's one of the easier cases to get your head around. If you've watched some videos already about the dative, or even one of my videos on cases in general, then you'll know that cases are really just like categories that help us to organize the nouns in our sentence so that we get a bit of an idea of what their function in the sentence is. There's the subject case, and it's called the nominative. There's the object case or the accusative. There's a case that we use for possessives, and then there's the dative. And in this video, I describe the dative as a bit of a multifunction case because that's really what it is. The dative gets used for quite a few things. So let's see if we can simplify the dative and make it, well, just a little bit less scary. And normally I think it would make sense to explain when to use the dative and how to use the dative. But first, I want to show you what it looks like, at least when we're using nouns. As you can see in this table over here, there are only ever really 3 different articles that we use in every case, regardless of which case we're using. Sometimes each gender has its own article, and the plural nouns have to share with the feminine that familiar article D. But in the dative, we've got an article for feminine nouns, a separate one for plurals, and then another for any other nouns that we might want to use. So that would be these ones. And in the dative, all of our feminine nouns are preceded by the articles that have an ER ending, like der, which you'll recognize because we've been using it up until now for masculine subjects. It will look like this. Sie hilft ihrer Mutter. Kauft seiner Tochter eine Katze. Wir fahren mit der Bahn. And then we've got plural nouns which are signalled by the articles with an en ending. And as you'll see in these examples, they're also pretty easy to recognize because there's always an n on the end of the plural noun, even if there's not one in the normal plural. Here's a couple of examples. Sie hilft den jungen Schülern. Kauft seinen Kindern eine Katze. Wir fahren mit den alten Fahrrädern. If you look carefully, you'll see that there's an N on the end of the article, the adjective, and the noun. And so that makes them pretty easy to recognize. And then we've got our masculine nouns and the neuter nouns, but we don't distinguish between them in the dative. Instead, we group them together and introduce them with articles that have an em ending, like in these examples. Sie hilft ihrem Vater. Kauft seinem Sohn eine Katze. Wir fahren mit dem Bus. Now, we haven't used this em ending before, so it's usually pretty easy to see when we've got a masculine or a neuter noun in the dative. But that's all well and good. We know what it looks like when we're using nouns with different genders, but when are we meant to be using the dative? Well, this is a good question. Let's look at the 3 main uses and then have a quick think about when else we might see the dative being used. First up are all of our locations. This has got to be, I think, one of the most obvious use cases for the dative. Anytime we're talking about where we are or where something happens, we need to be using the dative case. And just like in English, there are a lot of prepositions that help us to describe any location we might want to come up with. Let's list them and what we use them for. First up, we've got an. This mostly gets used for locations that are either at the end of something or the edge of something, or up against a vertical surface. This gives us examples like these. Der Hund ist gern am Strand. We're using an because the beach is the edge, or if you like, the end of the land. And we're using the contraction which really means an dem, because the beach is not feminine or plural. Hobart ist an der Küste. Here I'm using an der, firstly because the coast is feminine, but also because the coast is a kind of an edge. And then we've got der Mann steht an der Tür. The door is a vertical surface, so it makes sense to use the preposition an. We can use auf if our location is more of a horizontal surface. So it would make sense to say, unser Haus ist auf einem Hügel. Our house is on a hill. We're thinking about the flat surface on top here. From the article, we can tell that the word for hill, Hügel, is neither feminine nor plural. And interestingly, we'd also say, das bin ich auf dem Foto, since we're seeing the photo as a horizontal surface and not something that you're literally in. So, when can we use in? Much as we do actually in English. Like in English, we use in to describe a location inside something else. Der Mann ist in dem Haus. He's inside the house. Wir sind gern in der Stadt. Here we're thinking about the city as something you can be in, an enclosed space. It can also be more abstract things like a movie. Spielt in dem neuen Spielberg-Film. This is different to a two-dimensional photo. We're looking at the movie as a kind of a three-dimensional form that you can actually be in. Now, these would be the main prepositions we use for locations, but we could also use these too if you want to say that something is behind something else, in front of it, over it, under it, between it, and so on. To me here again, I just want to say that if you'd like to follow along with what we're talking about here, then a lot of what we're talking about is in the lucky last chapter of Bausteine 1, where we also summarize a lot of what you need to know in this first course. Okay, back to the video. But let's move on now to our next really important use of the dative. We often use the accusative case as the direct object case. Well then, the dative is often the indirect object case. And we've had one of these examples already. We said, kauft seiner Tochter eine Katze. You can see that we have three nouns in this sentence. Well, one of them is it's actually a pronoun. We've got someone, a he, doing some purchasing. What follows are two nouns. One of them is what he's buying. This is the direct object, and it's the cat. And the other is who he's buying the cat for. This is the indirect object, and here, in this example, it's his daughter. And we can see that the daughter is in the dative because this is a feminine noun and we've got that er ending that we associate with feminine nouns in the dative. It doesn't just work with the verb kaufen, of course. There are lots of other verbs where we also have an indirect object like these ones. Let's look at some more examples of how they work. We could say, sie macht dem Mann einen Kaffee. She's making a coffee, but she's making it for the man. So this makes our man the indirect object, and he has to be in the dative, which we can see because there's a typical em ending on the article. Another example might be, erzählt seiner Freundin einen Witz. He's telling a joke, yes, but he's telling the joke to his girlfriend. So the girlfriend is the indirect object, and because she's feminine, we'll see there's that typical er ending, seiner Freundin. We could also use the verb schicken to send. Sie schickt ihren Kindern eine Nachricht. She's sending a message, that's the direct object, and the person or people she's sending it to are the indirect object, and that would be her kids. And you'll recognize the dative plural here because of the N on the article and on the noun itself. In each of these cases, you'll see that the dative contains the idea of for someone or to someone. So whenever you're trying to express this idea in German, we'll often be using the dative. But let's move on to our last main use of the dative, and this is where we need to return to the idea of prepositions. We've already talked about locations with prepositions, but there are a lot of common prepositions that are always followed by the dative. All of these prepositions, in fact, aus, außer, bei, mit, nach, seit, von, and zu. If you've watched this video about going places in German, then you've already met the preposition zu because we used it for going to a lot of different places. Let's quickly see how we can use some of the others. In here, I just want to concentrate on the most common ones and the most useful ones. Let's start with mit. This means with, so you can see that we'd probably use it quite a lot. Here are some examples. Ich gehe mit meinem Hund spazieren. I walk with the dog. So it makes sense to use an article with that em ending since the dog's neither feminine nor plural. Or I could say, ich trinke Kaffee mit kalter Milch. Still the same idea, it's coffee with milk, but as you can see, we're not using an article, just an adjective. But our er ending for the milk, which is feminine, still indicates that we're in the dative. Or maybe, sie fährt oft mit dem Bus. This is a bit different to what we might say in English, where we'd say perhaps she's travelling with the bus rather than by bus or on the bus. But we're still using the typical em ending for the masculine bus in the dative. Let's look at another preposition that uses the dative. Seit is a handy one to use. We can use it to introduce actions that started in the past and are still happening now. For example, lernt seit 3 Monaten Deutsch. It's worth pointing out that we're in the present tense here since he's still learning German right now. But he started 3 months ago and he's been learning for 3 months. How do we know this is in the dative, especially since there's no article? Well, 1 month is der Monat, 3 of them would be die Monate. So in our sentence, you can see that there's an extra n on the noun, 3 Monaten. So here, seit means for, but it also has a slightly different meaning. Lernt seit letztem Januar Deutsch. This has much the same meaning, but instead of referring to a period of time, 3 months, it indicates a clear starting point last January. And you can see that this is in the dative because of the em ending on the word before the noun, the adjective letztem. Instead of working through all of the other prepositions, let's just look at some examples of them being used. Trinkt aus der Flasche. Ich verkaufe alles außer diesem Buch. Wohnt noch bei seinen Eltern. Nach der Schule spielt sie mit ihren Freundinnen. Das ist ein Foto von seiner Freundin. Geht morgens zum Park. So lots of examples there, each one of them using one of the prepositions that are always used with the dative. You can find lots more examples of each one in our textbook, Bausteine Eins, if you want to follow along, and quite a lot of practice exercises too. And check this out at the link in the description if that sounds something that might be useful to you. And let's turn to some of the other uses for the dative that we mention in Bausteine Eins. There's all those verbs that are always used with the dative. Here's a bit of a list, but we mentioned one of them at the start. Sie hilft ihrer Mutter. She helps her mother. The mother is feminine, and you can see it's in the dative because of that er ending. Now check out the list in the textbook to see how to use some of the others, especially those common ones like gefallen, gehören, and schmecken. We also use the dative in some of those idiomatic phrases like es tut mir leid, which is the German version of I'm sorry. It's obviously not a literal translation, but you'll see the dative pronoun mir, which we haven't talked about at all, but you'll find lots of them listed in Bausteine Eins. And you probably already know questions like wie geht's dir? If you're asking someone how they are doing, here the dative makes more sense because you're asking someone how things are going for them, which is what that pronoun dir means, for you. And then we also use the dative with adjectives in a form that we could call perhaps the personal dative. And you might well know this one too. Mir ist kalt. And this is an odd one because there's not a real subject in this sentence. You're saying, to me, it's cold. This is the way that you are personally experiencing the temperature. It's cold or you are cold. Similarly, if you're at a concert and you're finding the music just too loud, then you could say, es ist mir zu laut. It might be okay for everybody else, but it's too loud for you. And you could do the same thing with other adjectives like dunkel, langweilig, or blöd, if you wanted to say that something is too dark, too boring, or too stupid for you. And now I'd recommend that you head over to the final chapter in Bausteine 1, read through Teil C, Struktur, and work on some of the exercises, and we'll see each other in the next video. Let me know what you're having trouble with in the comments below. Danke fürs Zuschauen, bis zum nächsten Mal. Auf Wiedersehen und tschüss.